Hello, welcome back. Today I'm wiring up Swagger in a .NET API with Keycloak, so our front end can test and secure endpoints directly from docs. I wanted interactive API docs, but still locked behind auth, and also Swagger in dev staging only and not public in production. So what will we build? Swagger UI @/Swagger, OAuth2 Authorization Code plus PKCE with Keycloak, protected endpoints testable in Swagger, and we will have dev staging enabled and prod disabled. Alright, cool, so let's start. So since this is .NET 9, I'm using Swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core 9.0.6 to avoid v10 migration, for now at least. At some later point, I'll definitely update everything, but for now we're stuck with .NET 9 and its own packages. Okay, so OpenAPI is the spec, Swagger is the tooling /UI. I'm using Swashbuckle for UI and generation and not mixing it with the new add OpenAPI pipeline. Next, I'll wire add Swagger gen, add OAuth2 config and connect it to Keycloak with the correct browser-facing URL. Okay, so the first step is to lock down the API by default. With auth authorization and a fallback policy, every endpoint now requires an authenticated user unless I explicitly mark it with allow anonymous. That means I don't have to remember to add authorize attribute everywhere, and secure by default becomes the baseline. And now we can configure Swagger. So first, we register the Swagger document in Swagger doc. This gives us the API spec and version metadata. Then we define a security scheme named OAuth2. I'm using authorization code flow because this is the correct auth flow for interactive login from Swagger UI. One important detail, both authorization URL and token URL use Keycloak settings of public authority, and that is intentional because Swagger runs in the browser, so these URLs must be browser reachable. Then we can define some scopes, OpenID, profile, and email, and these are the claims my API and identity flow need for user identity context. Finally, we add a global security requirement referencing that OAuth2 scheme. What this tells Swagger is that operations require the security scheme, so the authorize button applies the token to API calls. And the result would be like, once you're authenticated, I can call secured endpoints in Swagger exactly like a front-end client would. So this is the whole point of our Swagger implementation. Now I'm adding the Swagger runtime block. I'll start with a straightforward version first, with inline values so we can verify behavior quickly. I gate it to dev and staging only, then enable use Swagger and use Swagger UI. Inside Swagger UI config, we will set the values that I'll add here. So the OpenAPI JSON endpoint, all client ID, auth redirect URL, and we're gonna enable PKCE. We can improve this setup by moving Swagger values out of code and into type configuration. First, I create a SwaggerSettings model with Swagger endpoint, auth client ID, auth2 redirect URL, and enable flag. Then I add a Swagger section in appsettings with those same values, and finally in Program.cs I bind config. This gives us cleaner code, environment-specific overrides, and no hard-coded auth Swagger values in the pipeline. And now we can replace hard-coded Swagger values in Program.cs with SwaggerSettings. Instead of inline strings, we can use Swagger endpoint, auth client ID, auth redirect URL, and the flag enabled. That means changing environment-specific values no longer requires code edits and just app settings updates. Okay, so now in our Keycloak instance, in the realm, we can create a new client that's not going to be confidential. Client ID, let's set it as Recurrio Swagger, not as Description Manager API, and name can be the same value. In Keycloak, capability config is critical because it defines which auth flows this client can use. For Swagger, this client runs in the browser, so we configure it as a public client, and that's why client authentication is off. A browser can safely keep a client secret. We enable standard flow because Swagger uses authorization code flow, and we enabled PKCE, or we will enable it after we save everything, because public clients need proof of possession during code exchange. We left implicit direct access grants, device, and SIBA off because Swagger doesn't need them. Disabling unused flow reduces, obviously, attack surface. So the capability setup is only what Swagger needs and nothing extra. And maybe a part worth mentioning is that I already have a confidential client set up for my backend, but since this is again exposed on the browser, in the browser, we cannot use that. So this is why we are creating a new client in our realm. In login settings, the key thing is the exact URL matching. We set valid redirect URIs to the Swagger callback URL, for example. We set web origins to the Swagger origin, and if these don't match exactly altogether, Keycloak rejects login or token exchange. So this step is mostly precision. If you miss, you can always, redo it. An exact redirect URL and exact origin for each environment must be there. Okay, cool. Last thing is just, going to advanced settings and setting the PKCE. So it is called prove key for code exchange code challenge method, and we set it to S256. And yeah, that should be pretty much it. Now we can go and test it and see in the end it worked, and we can see how everything works in a bit. All right, so let's just quickly test it out. We're gonna fill in our client ID, select the scopes, and try to authorize. I hid my email here. I don't know if it matters, but I did. And we can see that we successfully logged in, and now I can try to go through some API calls and see if everything works, which it should. And just looking at the transactions, we can also try like user claims and users. So yeah, let's just quickly see. And everything works, everything seems to work. We got transactions, and I think that's pretty much it. Like, it just kept going on through testing this out, and everything worked. Logout works as well, and yeah, I mean, that wasn't too hard, but it does help with testing APIs and like exposing them maybe for other people that are working on the application, so they can test in different staging or whatever they're doing. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm just gonna say that thank you for watching this video. Hope you find it helpful. If you do like and subscribe, and yeah, bye bye.